Hi kids! Boy, do we have something special ready for you today. Ready, Barry?
Yep.
Hit it!
She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, 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 yeah. You think you've lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. She said she loves you, and you know you should be glad. She said you hurt her so, she almost lost her mind. And now she says she knows you're not the hurting kind. She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. Yes, she loves you, and you know you should be glad. Ooh, she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. You know it's up to you. I think it's only fair. Pride can hurt you too. Apologize to her because she loves you, and you know that can't be bad. Yes, she loves you, and you know you should be glad. Ooh, she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. She loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. With a love like that, you know you should be glad. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Today, we'll be talking about the advantages of various forms of political participation over voting. It would be helpful if you have this handout that I either gave out in class or you can download it from my website. Before we get started on the other forms of political participation, let's remember a few things about voting itself. Voting is the most common form of political participation in the United States, but it only is available, it only happens every 2 years or so. It is done in private and in secret, so no one knows how you vote or why you voted for a certain candidate or for a certain issue. And it's not issue specific. Someone just wins. Some candidate simply wins and gets the power, but doesn't really know why specific voters like you voted for that person, and therefore doesn't really know what he's supposed to do with his power in office. So let's look at some other forms of participation that might be available to us that would allow us to communicate our ideas to the government in ways that are superior to the act of voting. Some of the other forms of political participation available to us are membership in an interest group, a political party, or a PAC; litigation, which means court action or bringing a lawsuit; actually contacting the media or government officials directly; contributing to candidates' campaigns; volunteering for a campaign or in voter registration type work; actually running for or holding office; and protests, marches, and rallies are another form of participation. Regarding membership in an interest group, political party, or PAC, you haven't been taught specifically what these organizations are. That'll come later in Unit 3. But for now, here are some really quick definitions of these organizations. Interest groups are organized groups of people who try to influence the government decisions in a variety of ways. For example, lobbying. You may have heard of that. Political parties are organized groups of people who try to gain power directly by running for and winning office. And political action committees exist simply to raise money for candidates so they can use them to campaign. What are some of the advantages of being a member of these groups or participating in these groups over voting? Well, first of all, remember, voting is a private, solitary act, and by joining an organization, you get a feeling of solidarity that you get from belonging to a group. Also, by working with others, perhaps to lobby the government, maybe to support the candidates you want to win with your work or with funding, or contributing to using the media to support or oppose candidates. This magnifies the effect of you simply voicing your opinion in a voting booth. Litigation is using the legal system, the court system, to bring about a change you want to see. We'll learn more about the differences between civil and criminal cases later. But for now, you're basically, in using litigation, you're using the court system to change how existing laws or the Constitution are enforced or interpreted. Remember, voting, you simply try to get your candidate into office. But using litigation, you might sue somebody, sue a company, let's say, and get the court system to change how a law is enforced or interpreted, which bypasses Congress and the President completely and can accomplish something much quicker. Another interesting aspect of legal action is that you're not appealing to public opinion. You don't need millions and millions of other people to vote like you. You are bringing arguments inside a courtroom. You're appealing to legal principle, not public opinion. So a numerical majority is not necessary. And you can accomplish something that you cannot accomplish through the other branches that are more democratic. I'll give you a couple examples. You may remember a case you might have learned about in history class, Plessy versus Ferguson. Well, Homer Plessy intentionally broke the law by trying to board a whites-only railroad train in Louisiana. So he intentionally created a criminal case that made it through the court system up to the Supreme Court. Now, he didn't get the decision that he wanted, but it's an example of how one might use even a criminal action or a criminal case to change how the Constitution is interpreted. A better example, a more successful example, would be Brown versus Board of Education. The Brown family, along with others, sued, claiming that their local school districts were unconstitutional because they were racially segregated, and we all know how that court case came out. And there have been lots of cases like that, not as famous, but it is a common way for people to get the government to change its policies. When it comes to contacting the media or government officials, remember, you're not just doing something in secret, in private, in a voting booth. You are actually contacting the media or government directors, government leaders directly. You get to influence them a little more that way than anonymously through the ballot box. You're able to articulate specific policies that you want them to pursue or enact, and this can be in the media or directly to government leaders. And by being one of the few people who actually do this, instead of millions of anonymous votes, you can be one of 100 letters to your senator, let's say. So you magnify your personal power by being one of the few people making such contact and getting attention to your concerns and issues. Campaign contributions. Politicians need money to campaign with. So that's great if you walk into a voting booth and cast one vote for them on election day. But if you are able to contribute money to a campaign, they will use that money to use the media to attract other voters. So you're, again, multiplying the force of your individual preference by giving the candidates a way to reach more people. And obviously, depending on how much you are able to give, you may gain access directly to political officials. Although, yes, realistically, that would be as a result of giving lots of money that most people can't do. By working or volunteering for a campaign or doing voter registration work, again, you're multiplying the force of your individual interest because you're working with others, either in support of your candidate, or to get other people to vote, hopefully drawing more people to your cause and into the political system, into the voting process. Again, it's possible when you're doing this kind of work that you might actually gain individual direct contact with the officials that are running for office. And it's also a good training ground for learning about how our system works, how elections work, how campaigns work. It's a good training ground to educate citizens about how our system really works. So all of these are advantages to over and above simply the act of voting. If one were to run for office and actually win and hold office, so you're not voting for other people anymore, you are trying to become the person with power. And obviously, I think, you're going, by having power, that's way more powerful than simply casting 1 out of 1,000 or 1,000,000 votes, because once you have power, you have direct influence on the government's agenda. The agenda is basically the things that the government is trying to decide that it wants to try and solve, problems it wants to solve, problems it wants to try and tackle. That's the agenda. And when it comes to voting on laws, you are one of the decision makers. You get to decide what laws get passed, or at least participate in deciding what laws get passed, which is a big advantage over simply casting votes in a voting booth. And finally, doing public displays like protests and marches and rallies. What they do is they bring public attention to your cause, and that may, since these things typically do get covered by the media, they tend to attract more supporters to your cause. If you do it peacefully, this could, generate more sympathy among the public and bring more people to your cause. They usually don't cost very much. Obviously, campaign contributions cost a lot. Litigation costs a lot because you have to hire lawyers. Getting permits is pretty cheap, and getting organizing rallies and conducting them usually don't cost much money. They're open to anyone. You don't have to be a registered voter to march in a rally, and non-citizens can do it. People who aren't old enough to vote can do it. So there's that advantage. And depending on the issue, but depending on the timing, sometimes the government does react quite quickly to. Remember back during the Civil Rights Movement, there were a lot of good examples of public mass action type of events that got the government's attention and did generate fairly quickly responses, like the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. These are all options in addition to voting, which is important. I will always say that. But there are other things you can do in between elections that have a larger effect and perhaps a more direct effect on who gets elected or what our government does in response to specific issues. So I hope all of this made sense, and I will see you back in class. Whoops, almost forgot. I'm supposed to also cover this topic, reasons for the low U.S. voter turnout. Some of you may have the form, the piece of paper where you can take these notes. If not, you can get them off my website. But basically, here's a quick rundown of some of the reasons why Americans have such a shameful, embarrassingly low voter turnout, at least compared to most other democracies. First of all, there's just good old apathy. Apathy is the lack of interest or enthusiasm or concern. In other words, some Americans don't vote because they simply don't care about politics. Or they just, on election day, they say they're too busy or they just can't. Whatever. There's also the difficulty of registering. Now, you all have seen a registration form and you know that it's not difficult, but it does take a few moments. It does take a little bit of time and a little bit of effort. So that's more than zero effort, which in some countries you're automatically registered to vote when you turn a certain age. But in our country, you're not. And the fact that you have to do one thing in order to vote, some people just neglect to do that one thing, and therefore they don't vote. They can't vote, so they don't vote. Next, Americans have a very mobile population compared to a lot of countries. We move around a lot. You know, we go off to college. We find jobs across the country, and maybe move several times during our lifetimes. And remember, with our federal system, states. States handle the voting process, and so every time your address changes, either within a state or you move to another state, you have to re-register, tell the government again where you live so they know where to assign you to vote. As you may have noticed, many political advertisements are what we call negative, meaning they don't promote the good things about a candidate. They simply run down a candidate's opponent by bringing up all sorts of awful things about the other person. This is also called mudslinging. And it works, which is why politicians do it. However, most people watch those kinds of ads and they get turned off of politics. They're driven away from politics by only seeing the ugliness that candidates have to say about each other. And some people, that does kind of build up and have an effect and cause some people just not to vote. Also, Americans participate in other ways than voting, and you just took notes on some of those methods. And so some people will say, well, I've volunteered, I've marched, I've rallied, I've done other things, so maybe on election day you're not that motivated to actually vote. And that brings down voter turnout. We have a plethora, that means a large number of offices and elections in the U.S. that we vote for. We vote at least every 2 years in national, state, and local elections with all those candidates and offices that we're supposed to know something about. When we walk into a voting booth, plus all the referenda that we're supposed to be educated about, and voting on specific issues. In some people, this produces what is sometimes called voter fatigue. You're not actually physically exhausted, but you are kind of mentally worn out, and you've decided, well, it's too much to keep track of all this stuff. I can't keep track of the candidates. I don't remember who I'm voting for, who I should vote for. I haven't paid attention to the commercials. I haven't educated myself on the issues. So voters frequently get overwhelmed by all the choices they have to make, and decide in a given election, maybe I'm not going to vote this year because I'm just not ready to cast an intelligent vote. Some people would say we suffer from too much democracy in this country because there's so much to vote for, and some people decide to simply tune it out. Here are two similar reasons why voter turnout has declined, at least statistically, ever since we ratified the 26th Amendment and young voters entered the electorate. As you should have heard in class, the lower age group has a very low voter turnout. So if you inject into the electorate millions of people with low voter turnout, that brings down the overall average of the entire electorate. So ever since the mid-70s or earlier mid-70s, these 18 to 25-year-old voters who don't vote have contributed to our statistical low voter turnout. Similarly, and during about the same time period, going back 40 or 50 years, the minority population, meaning the non-white population of America, has been growing faster than the white population. And since many minority groups have lower voter turnout than the white majority, as that part of the population grows percentage-wise, then that also contributes to a statistical decline in overall voter turnout. Another reason some people say that we have low voter turnout is that election day is a work day. We hold elections on Tuesday as a general rule. It's not a holiday, which means most people have to take off work or do it before work or after work. And it makes it kind of a hassle. And on a given day, some people just might not get the chance because they're busy at work or they forget, and to squeeze it in among everything else you have to do. Sometimes people just choose not to vote or just can't get it done, which brings down voter turnout. Voting is not compulsory. That means it's not required. It's not legally required, as it is in some countries. Not that it happens very often, but in some countries, you might be fined or penalized in some other way for not voting. That would never happen here, but it works in some countries, and is one reason possibly why other countries have higher turnout than we do. Also, the Republican Party has historically resisted efforts to raise voter turnout for whatever reasons. Ideas like early voting or voting by mail. These are only ideas backed by the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party. And typically, lately, I think this has been covered in class too, the Republican Party has pushed in many states for various forms of photo ID laws, which have been found in many occasions to reduce voter turnout by making it harder to vote. There's no place specifically where you're supposed to write this down. I don't have a form for you to take these notes, and there's no place in the study guide for this, but just since we're on the topic, what are some of the ideas that have been raised over the years for bringing up our abysmally low voter turnout in this country? Some people say we'll make election day a holiday, move it to a weekend, perhaps. Something like that would make it easier for people to vote. Do other things to make voting more convenient. Some states have enacted what we call early voting, which means, let's say the actual election day is in early November. There might be polling sites available scattered around a county or a state on the 2 or 3 weekends before election day, so that people can do it at a more convenient time. Plus, that reduces the lines that might occur and the waiting that might have to be done on election day itself. So that's a good idea, and Maryland has been doing that for several election cycles. Some states permit voting by mail, and I believe Oregon only votes by mail. So there's no such thing as having to get to a certain place by a certain time on election day. You vote by mail in the weeks or in days before what we call election day, and the machines count your votes that way. So that makes it a lot easier for people to vote. Some countries automatically register you to vote once you reach voting age. That's an idea that hasn't really gotten any traction here in this country, but it's an option, and some people are looking into it. And then there's also just efforts more effort that could be put into getting out the vote, GOTV. Government could do it. Political parties could do a better job at getting their voters out. So that's in various ways, just by publicity or other forms of persuasion. Anyway, there are ideas floating around out there, and just in case it comes up on a test, I thought you should know. Anyway, good luck on your Unit 2 test, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.